I'm 29 years old, and I can't say that my life has always gone in a straight line. One day, I met him, though at the time, I never could have imagined that this person would become the center of my existence. It all started simply and ordinarily. A mutual group, one evening when, seemingly, nothing should have made him stand out from the crowd. But for some reason, I remembered him. There was something about him that set him apart. His gaze, his movements, the way he spoke. Although at that moment, I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. We crossed paths a couple more times on the street, exchanged a few words, and that was enough for me to start thinking about him, even when I didn't want to. One day he called. As I later found out, he had gotten my number through a mutual acquaintance, who probably didn't realize what storm this would cause. I answered, though I wasn't sure why he needed to talk to me. We lived in the same neighborhood, and I knew everything I could know about him. He was married. And, as you can guess, I was married too. And yet, he called. At first we talked about small things, but to my surprise, he turned out to be such an interesting conversationalist that I didn't notice how an hour passed. We talked about everything, hobbies, work, life. A couple of days later, he suggested meeting for coffee, and I agreed. It was a simple meeting. No hidden intentions or double meanings. We sat in a small cafe near my house, laughed, discussed a variety of topics. His company was easy, as if we had known each other all our lives. After that meeting, our conversations became more frequent. We started calling each other almost every day, discussing everything under the sun. After a while, we met almost every day, drank coffee, walked around, and it became our little tradition. Gradually, he became a part of my life, so naturally that I didn't even notice when it happened. One day, I even introduced him to my husband. Of course, it seemed silly, but at the time, I truly believed we were just friends. I refused to meet his wife, though he had offered. Deep down, I knew I couldn't keep up the same illusion with her. Over time, our friendship grew deeper. We shared everything that concerned us. When I was struggling, he was there. When joy filled me, he was the first to know. But one day, my life began to crack at the seams. My husband, the man I had been with for nearly 10 years, made a decision that shocked me. He decided to move to another city, closer to his mother, who lived alone. I couldn't blame him for this desire, but it seemed like he was completely disregarding my needs. Over all these years, I had sacrificed so much for our family. I left my job to support him, raised a child, earned a degree. And now, he wanted me to give up everything I had built for the sake of his mother. It was too much for me. We discussed it many times, but each conversation ended in a deadlock. I didn't want to change my life, and he didn't want to stay here. At that moment, he, my friend, was there. He listened, supported me, and I realized I was beginning to see him as more than just a friend. But I didn't allow myself to think about it seriously. I tried to ignore my feelings, convincing myself that this was temporary, that I just needed to wait until life found its balance again. But balance never came. Our meetings continued, and one day, my friend, noticing us together, asked me a question I had avoided asking myself. "Don't you see that he loves you?" That question stuck in my mind, and I began to notice things I had been trying not to see. His care, his glances, the way he spoke to me, and gradually I realized that she was right. After the conversation with my friend, I couldn't shake her words. They pulsed in my mind like an obsessive melody. He loves you. Everything I had been denying suddenly became clear. I began noticing everything, how he looked at me, how he smiled, how he always found time for our meetings, even if it interfered with his own plans. We spent more and more time together, and I felt myself becoming dependent on his presence. I didn't know if this was right, but somehow it felt like the only thing that gave me strength. Meanwhile, my husband grew more distant. His plan to move to his hometown had become an obsession. We discussed it over and over again, and each time the conversations ended without resolution. He saw it as the only way forward, while I saw it as the end of everything we had built together. Our relationship became even more strained. He was irritable. I was exhausted. It was like we were speaking different languages. The only person I could truly be myself with was him. For Christmas, my husband decided not to do anything. To him, it was just another day, and he didn't see the point in spending time on show, as he called it. But for me, Christmas had always been important, a time to be with loved ones, to create a bit of warmth and magic. So I decided to spend the evening with him, the person who had already become part of my life, even though I didn't yet realize how deeply he had infiltrated it. We sat in my living room, watched an old movie, and drank hot chocolate. Everything was so simple, so ordinary, but there was something special in that coziness. We talked about childhood, about the things that made us happy. It felt like, in that moment, it was just the two of us. The night came quickly, and he stayed with me. But nothing happened between us. No touches. We both understood that once we crossed that line, we wouldn't be able to go back. This silent understanding bound us more strongly than any words. The next day, we discussed the previous night. He thanked me for not doing anything that would have ruined our relationship. I thanked him for the same. We both knew there was something more between us, but neither of us dared to take a step forward. It felt like we were both trying to protect the fragile thread that kept us on the edge. But inside, a fire was already burning, one that I couldn't extinguish. Over time, everything only became more complicated. We still pretended it was just friendship, but to be honest, it was the strongest connection I had ever felt. His support, his understanding, his laughter, all of it had become a part of my life, something I could no longer live without. He knew me better than anyone else. I started thinking about him as I fell asleep and as I woke up, and the more I tried to deny my feelings, the clearer it became that I was in love. One night, he called me. There was something in his voice that I hadn't heard before. Desperation. He almost shouted, saying that he couldn't live like this anymore. "You don't understand," he said. "I can't live without you." Those words broke something inside me. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to do. All I felt was that this was the moment I had feared the most. We decided that our communication should become less frequent, a few calls a week, at most 1 or 2 meetings. It was the right decision, but for me, it was unbearable. I hung up the phone, and a wave of pain hit me. Tears flowed freely. It felt like with every breath I took, I was losing a part of myself. That night, I dressed and simply walked through the streets of our neighborhood. It was a cold January night, snow softly falling to the ground, but none of that registered with me. I felt my heart clenching from the pain. I couldn't accept a reality where he wasn't by my side. Finally, freezing, I went into a small cafe on the corner to warm up. The owner, whom I knew, noticed my condition, but I brushed it off, saying I had just had an argument with a friend. At that moment, the door opened and he walked in. His gaze was as lost as mine. He bought a bottle of wine and was about to leave. We locked eyes, and I realized I couldn't leave without saying something that had been burning inside me. We stood outside, silent. At some point, I realized I couldn't keep everything inside any longer. We embraced. It was natural, like breathing. And then it happened. We crossed that line we had been afraid to cross for so long. After that night, everything changed. We knew we had taken a step that there was no turning back from, but something inside me still clung to the old life, to its illusory stability, to what seemed right. The next day, I woke up with a heavy feeling. A million questions swirled in my mind. What comes next? How will we live with this? I felt lost, but at the same time, for the first time in a long while, I felt a strange peace. Perhaps it was the realization that I was no longer alone. We didn't discuss what happened right away. It seemed like we both were afraid to destroy the fragile balance that still kept us afloat. We continued meeting, talking, but now there was this secret between us, binding us even more tightly. We still tried to convince ourselves that we could keep our lives the way they were, but that was an illusion. We knew everything had already changed. A few days later, he called me and told me his wife was pregnant. I remember how I went silent, gripping the phone, not knowing what to say. It was news that shattered my world. I felt the ground beneath me disappear. First, there was the shock, and then a wave of pain. He said something, tried to explain his feelings, but I could hardly hear him. All I could think about was how now there was a vast chasm between us. I couldn't ask him to leave his family. I couldn't allow myself to be the cause of such betrayal. We agreed that we would see each other less, and I desperately tried to believe that it would help. But instead, I only felt the emptiness more intensely. He had become a part of my life, a part without which I could no longer exist. I tried to distract myself, do something to forget about him for at least a few hours, but everything reminded me of him. It was torture, the kind I had brought upon myself. He was suffering too. We tried to keep our distance, but it never lasted long. Every time we decided to stop meeting, it always ended with one of us not being able to hold out. I remember one time he came to me after another argument with his wife. He was defeated, his voice trembling when he said, "I can't keep doing this." He stayed with me that night, but in the morning I insisted he go home. I knew that if he left her, it would be wrong. I couldn't be the one to destroy his family, especially now that they were expecting a child. But our attempts to keep distance were doomed to fail. We couldn't let go of each other, no matter how hard we tried. It was like a prolonged dance on the edge of a cliff, where each step could be the last. We kept returning to the same conversations. What are we doing? How do we end this? And each time we came to the same conclusion. We couldn't stop. At some point, it seemed like I had lost control of my life. Everything revolved around him, our meetings, our conversations. I almost stopped thinking about myself, about my needs. All that mattered was being with him. But with that came the guilt that tore me apart inside. I hated myself for letting it go this far, for making my life dependent on another person. I was angry at him for not making a decision, for not leaving me alone. But most of all, I was angry at myself for not being able to just walk away. At that time, it seemed like my husband didn't even notice what was happening. He was focused on his plans, on the move. Our conversations became fewer and more dry. He didn't even try to understand what I was feeling, and that only deepened my sense of alienation. I began to feel that our marriage had died long ago, and all that remained was a facade. But even knowing this, I couldn't force myself to take a decisive step. Perhaps it was the fear of the unknown, of what would happen next. There were moments when I tried to end it all. Once, I even wrote him a long message explaining that I couldn't live like this anymore, that we needed to sever our connection so that each of us could move forward. But when he read it, he just called and said, "I can't live without you." And I realized that I couldn't live without him either. It was a vicious circle, one that I didn't know how to escape. I started noticing how my emotional state was slowly tearing me apart from the inside. Day by day, I lived in a closed cycle of pain, doubt, and inexplicable hope. He was always nearby, even when we tried to distance ourselves from each other. We both knew that continuing this was wrong, but each time we found an excuse. This is the last time, I would tell myself over and over, but it was always a lie. Every week he would call me after arguing with his wife. He complained that they barely spoke, that her pregnancy had turned their home into a battlefield. I listened to him, tried to support him, but each time I felt bitterness building up inside me. He stayed there with her, despite everything between us, and I kept living in a state of waiting, as if I depended on his decisions. Most of the time, he would leave his house to go to his mother's when he couldn't stand being around his wife anymore. I knew he would never come to me because I had been clear. If he left her for me, I couldn't accept that. I thought it would give me some moral justification, but deep inside, I knew it only deepened our dependence on each other. It was an endless game with no winners. I started sleeping poorly. Sleepless nights were filled with thoughts about how I ended up in this situation. Sometimes I would just lie there, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand where I had gone wrong. Occasionally, I thought about divorce. My marriage had turned into a formality, an agreement between two people who had long lost something important. But I was afraid to take the step that would change everything. The fear of loneliness paralyzed me. Sometimes I tried to find comfort in everyday tasks. I took care of the house, worked, spent time with the child. When he was around, life seemed a bit more meaningful. We played, read books, and although it was hard for me, I tried to be a good mother. But as soon as he left to be with his father, everything went back to how it had been. The emptiness that filled my house became unbearable. I spent my days filling them with routine, but it didn't bring relief. One day, I began to realize how far I had gone with my justifications. I tried to convince myself that my feelings for him were just an escape from reality, a way to fill the emptiness. But if that were true, why did every smile, every look from him seem so real? Why couldn't I just forget him? These questions tormented me, but there were no answers. He was trapped too. I could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. We both knew that it couldn't continue like this, but neither of us could take the first step. Sometimes it felt like we were bound together by an invisible thread, one that couldn't be broken. And every time I tried to walk away, he found a way to pull me back. Not with words or promises, but simply with his presence. At some point, I began to wonder, what if we could really be together? What if this wasn't just a fleeting infatuation, but something more? These thoughts filled me with hope, but at the same time, they terrified me. I knew that if he left his family, everything would change. It wouldn't be a beautiful fairy tale. It would be a complicated, painful reality. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Guilt became my constant companion. I blamed myself for letting this relationship go so far, for putting both myself and him in this situation. Sometimes it seemed like I was simply incapable of making the right decision. I was afraid to break the connection because I couldn't imagine how I would live without him. But I was also afraid to continue because I knew it was destroying both of us. One day, I decided I needed to leave, even if just for a little while. Take a break to sort myself out. I took the child to his father, explaining that I needed some time to clear my head. I went to a friend's house in another state. It was my way of trying to create distance between us. I didn't tell him where I was going, didn't pick up the phone when he called. I needed time to figure out who I was and what I wanted. But even from a distance, he stayed in my head. I sat on my friend's porch, watching the sunset, and thought about how things could have been different. Could we have met in another life, under different circumstances, where everything would have been simpler? These thoughts only added to the pain. I knew I couldn't continue living like this, but I didn't know how to stop it. The time spent at my friend's place was quiet and almost futile. Each day I tried to convince myself that I was on the path to freedom, but it always ended the same way. Thoughts of him. At a distance, his image grew even stronger. I didn't know what he was doing, what he was thinking, and it drove me crazy. I tried talking to my friend, but she only knew that I was having difficulties in my marriage. I couldn't admit to her what was truly destroying me. One evening, I picked up my phone and simply stared at the screen. His name was in my contacts, like a magnet, pulling my attention. I wanted to text him, but I knew it would drag us back into the same vicious cycle. I set the phone down, but after 5 minutes, I picked it up again. All I could do was send a short message. I miss you. These 2 words felt both too simple and too heavy. When he replied almost instantly, I felt a mix of relief and weight. I miss you too, he wrote. His reply was short, but it carried everything I already knew. We couldn't stay away from each other, even when we tried to do it for our own sake. After this message, I decided to go back home. The pause I had tried to create proved useless. The only thing I realized during that time was that I was still stuck in the same trap. Returning home was cold and empty. My husband wasn't there. He had gone to his mother's again to prepare for the move. This gave me time to think, but instead of clarity, I only felt suffocating uncertainty. My home, which had once been a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. There was no joy, only the shadows of the past that I couldn't shake. The next day, I called him. Our conversation was calm, almost mundane, but every word he spoke filled me with a mixture of joy and pain. He said he wanted to see me, and I, of course, agreed. We met at the park, the place where we used to enjoy walking. It had always been our quiet corner where we could escape from the rest of the world. When I saw him, my heart stopped. He looked tired, but his eyes still sparkled with the warmth I knew too well. We walked along the paths, talking about little things, avoiding the main topic. But eventually, he stopped, looked at me, and said, "I can't live like this anymore." His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the last few months. I remained silent. What could I say to him? I couldn't live like this anymore either, but we had no way out. He spoke about his marriage, about how he felt like a stranger in his own home. His wife was consumed with her pregnancy, and he felt out of place, but he couldn't leave. "It's wrong," he repeated, almost as if convincing himself, and I understood him because I felt the same way. After this meeting, I realized that we had come full circle. We could talk all we wanted about how difficult everything was, but nothing had changed. We were still in this painful bond from which neither of us could break free. Sometimes I wondered how long this could continue. A year? 2? Eternity? But there was no answer. I tried to focus on my work, on my child, on the things that gave me some semblance of stability. But it was difficult. Every little thing reminded me of him. Things I once loved doing now seemed meaningless. I started to notice how I was gradually losing myself. I was no longer the woman who could handle everything life threw at her. I had become a shadow of myself. Meanwhile, my husband continued making plans for our new life. He talked about how everything would be good in the new place, how we could start fresh. But I knew that page had already been written, and nothing could change that. He probably understood this, but he kept holding on to his illusions, just as I held on to mine. One day, I tried to talk to him. I wanted to say that I couldn't keep living like this, that I needed something to change. But he just brushed it off, saying I needed to rest more. His indifference was another nail in the coffin of our relationship. I realized that he had long since stopped noticing me, just as I had stopped noticing him. When I realized I was trapped by my own emotions and decisions, I was faced with a single dilemma. Could I live on without changing anything? The answer was obvious, but I still clung to the remnants of hope. Hope that everything would resolve on its own, that he would finally make a choice, or that I would find the strength to end it. But the reality remained unchanged. Nothing was changing, and I gradually began to understand that perhaps it would always be like this. He still called me after every argument with his wife. His voice sounded weary, and it seemed like he was waiting for some kind of decision from me, one I couldn't give. He said his wife had become more withdrawn, that they barely spoke. But he stayed. Every time I asked why, he would look away or change the subject. And I knew why. He couldn't leave his future child, and I couldn't blame him for that. I tried to reduce our contact, as we had agreed before, but it was nearly impossible. Our lives had become so intertwined that separating one from the other seemed impossible. I could leave, start over somewhere else, but the thought of that seemed unbearable. I imagined him staying here, continuing his life without me, and that thought tore me apart inside. One evening, he called me late. I could hear that he had been drinking, but there was something in his voice that I hadn't heard before. Deep despair. "I don't know what to do," he said. "I'm tired of pretending, tired of living this lie." His words struck me because I felt the same way. I, too, was tired. Tired of the lies, the fear, the endless attempts to find a solution that didn't exist. After that call, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, holding the phone in my hands. I thought about how we had reached this point, how an ordinary friendship had turned into something that had destroyed both of us. I remembered our conversations, our walks, the moments when I felt truly alive, and it hurt to realize that all of this had led us to such an end. I tried to imagine what my life would look like without him. It was difficult, almost impossible. But what was even harder to picture was that everything would stay the same. I knew I was at a crossroads, and that things would only get worse from here. I thought about my child, about the example I was setting for him, being stuck in these relationships that were destroying me. I thought about my husband, who probably suspected but chose to ignore the obvious. And of course, I thought about him, the person who had become everything to me, but who could never belong to me. That night, I made a decision. I didn't know if I had the strength to follow through with it, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The next morning, I wrote him a message. I told him that we needed to end this, that we both deserved more, that I couldn't keep living in constant pain, waiting for something that would never happen. I pressed send and felt my heart constrict. His response was short. "You're right." Those were the most painful words I had ever read, because I knew he felt that same pain. But I also knew it was the right thing to do. We had been destroying each other, and the only way out was to break the connection. A few weeks passed. I tried to hold myself together. I focused on work, on my child, on finding myself again. It was hard. Every day I felt something inside me urging me to go back, to write to him again, to hear his voice. But I knew I couldn't. I had to move forward. Sometimes I wondered what it would have been like if we had met under different circumstances, if we had a chance to start fresh. But those thoughts only made the pain sharper. I tried to remind myself that the past couldn't be changed, and that sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves and others is to let go.